Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Today we'll discuss the opportunities and challenges in streaming hundreds of live events from Division II and Division III campuses. The money is nowhere near the millions pouring into some Division I programs. So the question becomes, what makes it worth the significant effort for these schools? My guests today are Steve Ulrich, a pioneer in media and tech usage when he was the longtime commissioner of the Centennial Conference, Katie Boldvich, the commissioner of the Landmark Conference, the first to partner with Flo Sports, who is jumping into this space with both feet, and Ryan Scott from D3Hoops.com, who has chronicled the workload increases being made on athletic communications professionals on these campuses. Thinking about streaming? Listen to these experts. Everyone, welcome to the podcast. Wow, do we have such a span of interest and perspectives on this podcast today? First, let me welcome Steve Ulrich. Steve is, of course, at the forefront of much of the tech world, the streaming world, when he was commissioner of the Centennial Conference. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. A pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you. Katie Boldvich is the current commissioner of the Landmark Conference, but she's been commissioner of almost every other conference under the sun at this point. But her conference was the first one in D3, if I have that correct, to sign the agreement with Flo Sports. So we're going to talk about that. Katie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And Ryan's a writer for D3 Hoops, who's been very involved in covering both men's and women's basketball from that perspective. He's been going like a crazy person over the last 4 days, trying to get ready for the NCAA tournament because there'll be more to write about there. Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So, Steve, just give us a brief summary. Back when you were the commissioner of the Centennial, you were pretty forward thinking. You had thought about the explosion of tech, the explosion of messaging with your constituents, your fans, your families on this new medium. Give us maybe a 2 or 3 minute introduction as to where you saw it back then.
Thank you. This probably goes back to the mid-2000s. We began to see the ability to stream video over the internet, and it became pretty clear to me as someone who had spent 10 years working in athletic communications, both at Cornell and Yale, that it was an opportunity to allow people who never got a chance to go to our games to be able to see them. Now, the Centennial Conference membership, the 11 schools, recruit nationally. So there are parents from all over the country and all over the globe. So knowing full well they weren't going to be able to make it to such outposts as Allentown, Pennsylvania, Chestertown, Maryland, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, it was on a Wednesday or a Tuesday night or something along those lines. I pitched it to our athletic directors how important it was going to be able to connect a camera and be able to use the structure that was already in place on campus to be able to broadcast games. It built from there. It became a situation of, well, do we need a second camera that shows the scoreboard? Do we need a score bug? Do we need a broadcaster? Do we need 2 cameras? Then it became a situation where we wanted to bring everything together under one umbrella and form a one-stop shop where everyone could see Centennial Conference action. So that's when we created the Centennial Conference Digital Network. And we kind of wanted to show Division III what was able to be done. And we've seen other conferences that have taken the ball and done even better things than I think I ever could have imagined in the early days.
It's tremendous. And do you have any idea what the stats were back then? Who was watching, how long they were staying on, or was it just the fact that you had it that was important?
At first, it was the fact that we had it. Then we began to, when all the schools were on board, we began to collect the data. How many unique viewers did we end up having? And we found that for the biggest basketball games, we would be approaching 1,000 to 2,000. As you went up further along in the tournament, it could be 3,000 to 5,000. The larger sports, football, lacrosse, for example, seemed to do higher numbers and higher viewership, but we kind of figured that was more parents involved. And when it really struck me, Karen, was the first day that Franklin and Marshall, where our home campus was, typically competes for students with Dickinson and Gettysburg, all three within an hour of one another. And when a volleyball player from the state of North Carolina chose Franklin and Marshall because her parents were going to be able to see her play, as you know, all 4 years, and this was back when, once again, in the mid-2000s, she selected F&M over the other two because of that. That was the confirmation that we were doing the right thing, and in that respect, kind of encouraged the other schools to catch up because they were going to fall behind in recruiting.
Okay, so fast forward to 2022, Katie, when Flo Sports approached you. Does that sound about right?
Sounds about right.
Okay.
Actually,
Okay.
23.
2023. Okay. So I'm assuming that the Landmark had not done much of any of this. Was there any individual attempt by schools to try to do it for home games?
To monetize?
Yeah.
No.
Or even just a stream, or even just a stream.
Yeah, so we had set up our Landmark digital network and had that for several years. So I think that's part of what made the transition of Flo Sports as positive as it was for our group, because we already had minimum broadcast standards as a league, different standards for our postseason event, and similar to what Steve had set up much sooner than the Landmark might not have even existed when Centennial Network was there. We had set up a one-stop click here, all of our schools were listed, all of our sports, so you could easily access all of our games in one spot. So we had that already. We just hadn't really thought to monetize that yet until we had talked to the folks at Flo Sports.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that process. Flo Sports is, I knew it as a company that was very involved in track at the very early part of there, but now they seem to be really embracing the Division III model, knowing that there's a gazillion sports on campus and lots of families interested in their son or daughter participation. So talk about the monetization.
So when they had come to me first, I was very close to ghosting. Steve can attest to this. We get a ton of vendor emails from random companies all the time, and it's just exhausting to answer everyone, honestly. And they always have the worst timing because they always email you around championship season. So I get an outreach about this time last year from Flo, and the person I worked with there had personalized it enough because they referenced the hockey conferences and the rowing. And I said, I'm not going to be a jerk. I'm going to respond to this. And I said, thank you so much, but we've always been opposed to monetization. My understanding is Flo Sports is pay-per-view, so I can't imagine our presidents being on board with that. Yeah. And kudos to him because he responded almost immediately and said, I get it. That's been a hurdle we faced before, but we have these real-life models in Division II. We feel the difference between the Division II and Division III broadcasts are negligible. We think you have a market here and can make money on things. Your product is worth something. Here are a few links in regards to recent deals we've struck with D2 conferences. Look at the financial figures, and if you really aren't interested, no harm, no foul. So I waited a few days, clicked on a few of those links, and when I saw they were in the 7 figures, I said, wow, I need to bring this to our presidents.
Yeah. Was there anything specific about the way they structured those deals that you thought this is pretty good beyond the bottom line number?
I think the engagement that they're having with our teams and special events on social media are things we can't really do. I'm a 2-person office, and we have an intern as well that's on 10 months. And God love all of us, but none of us are good at graphic design or video content creation or anything like that. So having a group that's willing to come into these special events or utilize footage that already exists and create content for us that our teams and fans and their families can engage with on social media is pretty special. So I'm really thankful for that part of our agreement, because that's really, I think, elevated our digital footprint, if you will. And given us a lot more clicks and brand awareness than we had in the past.
Do you find that your institutions are tracking on this as a whole? Like this is the kind of engagement the athletic department is getting because of this?
I don't know if they're tracking what's on social, especially because on something like Twitter, some of the views are so hard to really understand who's viewing, who's clicking. Is it the same person on 2 accounts? Is it the same person twice? It's not really clear. but we are obviously tracking on all of our views and the differences we've seen on behind a paywall versus when we were free a year ago.
Okay, sounds good. So Ryan, you have talked to, I think, 18 people who work in athletic communications across the landscape. And you learned a lot of information about what this decision that campuses made in good faith, trying to elevate their profile, trying to grow or stabilize their enrollment, all those good things. But this does have a negative impact on what group of folks?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's the very front line, like I'm now being asked to pay for something that was free before, right?
The parents, the friends, the
That
fans,
it's
yeah.
problematic. I do think a lot of it comes down to what you've had before and what you put out. I mean, that was the main thing I heard from people is the Landmark was uniquely set up to do this because they were producing already broadcasts at a level that was really high and that they were comfortable asking people to pay for, right? There was a number of conferences I talked to that said this was a no-go, not because we don't like the idea, but because we're going to have to invest so much to get to a level that we're comfortable asking people to pay for, right? There are still lots of D3 schools out there that stick one camera on a swivel and have no broadcast, or sometimes you don't even get the ambient sound, right? It's literally the same thing you'd get on like a scout video. And so, to go to the level that the Landmark has been at, and those schools had already invested in, was a step too far. I think the other part of that is just how disparate, and obviously all your listeners are going to know that, like an NCAA division actually is, right? It's made up of conference, we have 42 conferences in Division 3, and then there's all the individual schools. To do this from a way that someone like me who covers it nationally, there's a lot of reservations I have because I don't want to be paying 42 different subscriptions to be able to follow the game, right? And so it's just the unknown of what's going to happen over the next few years as conferences figure out what they're going to do and different platforms they might end up on, and whether that impacts the national scope, right? Do our top 25 voters have access to all of these games? I think it makes a lot of sense from a conference perspective where you're largely, dealing with parents or maybe alums who are willing to put some money in if it's going to help the athletic department. But for people who are maybe outside or growing the total, views of the sport, what is that going to look like is still very unknown, right? We're walking into a lot of questions, and so there's a lot of reservations from the outside of whether this is going to help in total or whether this is really just a value for the conferences and the schools themselves.
Ryan, you bring up a really good point that I had not considered, and that's the idea of having access to games that may or may not weigh in the favor of someone being nationally ranked. If the committee can see a team play more, does it favor them in the rankings, in the selection? Do you have any sense of how that works?
I think we try to do a good job, at least. So D3hoops.com that I work for sponsors the top 25 poll for the men's basketball, at least. And we try to do a good job of supplying people with as much information as possible. The schools are usually very good about doing that. But if you can't see a team, it is harder to rank them, right? And we have the one example in Division 3, the University of Rochester has been charging for home games for quite a while now. And there are complaints that it's harder to see those games. And they've pretty prominent school. They do pretty well. I don't think they've suffered for that, but that doesn't mean, some teams from a smaller profile or less tradition might not in the future.
Yeah, yeah. So Steve, you have a fantastic 5 days a week newsletter, D3 Playbook. It's allowed you to really aggregate and collect information across the D3 landscape. Plus you have your background as a D3 commissioner and all kinds of other experiences. What's your take on where this is going right now? What do you think other conferences are going to do? Is this going to become an essential commodity that they have to offer to their prospective students?
Well, interestingly enough, and for full disclosure, when the Landmark first announced their plans, I was very skeptical, to be quite honest with you. I had always taken the position of, these things should be free. If you're asking parents to foot a tuition bill that could be anywhere between $60,000 to $80,000, asking them to fork over $6-7 per game to watch their son or daughter participate just it didn't settle right.
Yeah.
Then I started producing a newsletter, and I was asking people to contribute to be able to read it on a daily basis. So I got a little hypocritical in that respect. As things continued to go forward, I began to realize that this really was going to be the direction the schools were going to need and conferences were going to need to go, because of the difficulties right now with finances in all of higher education.
Yeah.
Athletic departments are stretched beyond belief. You cannot believe the discussions that go on with conference athletic directors when officials want to raise their fees by $5 a game. You would be convinced that the world is collapsing. But when you begin to add up these little nickels and dimes along the way, it becomes substantial. So for us, I currently also serve as the play-by-play voice for Franklin and Marshall Athletics. So I'm involved with the production of the games as well. We hear from a lot of the schools that F&M competes with that, well, how do you guys get replays? How do you have 3 cameras set up? How do you get someone that has your expertise, Steve? Well, I mean, I come cheap. That's the good thing. But the investment in something as simple as a TriCaster to be able to provide different looks, that does not come cheap. Even hiring, getting cameras, hiring student workers seems easy enough. A lot of students don't want to work. Those who do have a habit of watching their phone while they're trying to maneuver the cameras. I'm sure Ryan can attest to. So there are outside expenses that go in just to the simple production of a game. And it's becoming more and more difficult for athletic departments to be able to fund that kind of investment. So for the Landmark to have someone from the outside say, we're going to help you provide, we're going to give you the funds to be able to invest in the production, raises their level of the game across the board. And I think it also then challenges competing conferences, whether that's in our region, Region 5, or around the Middle Atlantic area, to raise their game as well. And the only way we're going to be able to raise our game is most likely to be able to generate that kind of revenue to put back into it.
You know, that's a great point. That's one of the things that when the ACC formed their conference network, they were told by ESPN, you must raise your production capabilities, your broadcast studios, your fiber internet, all of those kinds of things to our standards in Bristol, Connecticut, which I was like, you got to be kidding me. So some of these schools spent $10 million on production suites, $18 million, just because they wanted to be ready for whatever the next generation was. So Katie, help us understand what that contribution from Flo Sports goes to at each institution and how they're spending it.
We were pretty lucky. We met all of their minimum standards for year 1 as a conference. And I think that was a really easy buy-in on our end because we said, we're already doing this that they're asking for. Next year, the only change, we're about 50-50 right now. So half of our schools will be adding a 3rd camera for football. And otherwise, it's pretty much business as usual, which is great. So what we did is we had a broad conversation with our athletic communicators and our ADs with, this is how much money we have in a perfect world. If everyone got an equal share, what do we want to use this on? Because our presidents had asked for that. Initially, we had just kind of wanted to do everything at once, and our presidents kind of tapped the brakes and said, well, hold on, like, let's be cognizant of how we're spending the money and, you know, what we want to focus on. So our SIDs and ADs went back and did a little research on camera costs and how much equipment each school had, how many broadcasts our schools could be putting up on one time, because that's another struggle. Sometimes you only have 2 to 3 kits on campus. So if you have a 4th kit, what misses? And a lot of times it's a sport like a tennis, unfortunately, or even a track. Some of the larger events are harder to broadcast. So our schools are utilizing their funds primarily on some new equipment, but nothing crazy, more to get themselves an extra kit so they can consistently broadcast everything that's happening on campus. They're paying more work study students to come and produce the game. We have broadcasters on pretty much all of our sports now, which is huge. We didn't have it in the past, and it's also not a requirement of Flo. But that's something our team said, you know, if this is something we can do and we have people that are interested and now we can pay them, why wouldn't we do it? And another big value add, some of our schools are even using the funding for additional salary enhancements or kind of bonuses for some of their sports info staff, just because we all know college campuses have been really tight. A lot of people haven't gotten raises or have gotten minimal raises over the past few years. So being able to have that bump to supplement a specific department on campus that I feel is consistently overlooked in the department, that was a no-brainer for us to be able to provide them that direct support.
So Ryan, let's talk about those people. There's the people who are on the ground trying to coordinate all of this. I've got a baseball facility off campus, a softball facility somewhere else. I've got a tennis court somewhere. I've got a stadium with football, field hockey, lacrosse, track. How do we do this, and who staffs all of this?
Well, I mean, I think the big thing is recognizing how much that job has grown over the last 20 years. Talking to some of the sports communicators that I did who've been on the job for a couple of decades, you know, they're talking about, you know, in the year 2000, your SID would go to the football game on a Saturday because that's where likely the press is and they want to deal with the press. And then the head coaches of your, you know, your soccer team or your volleyball, they'd make sure some student was keeping stats and they'd report it to you. You know, one SID said, once we got a website, that was a new thing. I had to start putting the stats on the website, and we do that once a week, regardless of when the games were, right?
Yep.
So that got updated once a week. And then you're starting to get audio broadcasts and then video broadcasts and then multicam broadcasts. And now you've got social media, right? The schools that have graphic design programs are doing a great job getting graphics up on a regular basis. And so this is all expanding for essentially one person, and maybe some places they're lucky enough to have an assistant. I remember one of the conversations I had, the guy said, "Oh yeah, I have my part-time assistant who works 40 to 50 hours a week as a part-time, you know, person." And that is very much the norm across the board. You're seeing people who have the skills to do this job well leaving because they can do PR in other industries for a lot more money and a lot less hours. And so we're seeing, and you know, not that they aren't well-meaning people, but a lot of younger people, a lot of people who don't really have a lot of experience doing this job. And it definitely affects the image that the school is putting out, the you know, the ability to recruit athletes, all of that kind of stuff that gets affected by this. And that's where the crunch is, right? Because it's usually somebody lower on the totem pole. They're not teaching classes. They're not, you know, like they're not seen as a value add in the same way to the department. And so those funds get pulled back.
Yeah, and I have seen it consistently throughout my career is that other than the athletic trainers, the athletic communications folks just get dumped on. Whenever there's another thing to add, there's never thought about how to expand that staff. And that's really what I wanted to try to talk about today, because everybody's all for this. They like the idea that the school gets more, you know, value out of it. The social media gets more clicks, but you've got to have a consistent brand across all the platforms. And you've got to consistently do it, not just kind of do it when one part-time student is doing it better than another part-time student by sport. So Steve, let me ask you this. Do you see any examples of schools trying to invest in their athletic communications staff and trying to really recognize that we're in a different world now with technology and media?
You know, as much as I would like to say yes, I'm afraid from where I sit, the answer is no. The job has changed so much. I started out as a sports information director all the way back in the 80s, and it's no longer about that part of the job. It is all about multimedia. You are now a communications expert, and the things that we thought were important back in the day to be able to write a story that was easily read, recap the game, as Ryan said, make sure that statistics were kept correctly and updated and made available to media members. That's way down on the totem pole at this point. It really turned into how can you get our campus's message out there, whether it's social and now, as we talked about with the growth of video. But I just don't see anybody saying to themselves, you know what, we need a third person, a third full-time person in the office. So rare that you have two. you might be lucky to get an intern, but when coaching staffs are asking for a first full-time assistant, it's very hard to convince those who are making the decisions that it's time to add another communicator to assist with multimedia, when you could just get a junior or a senior who knows all about TikTok to be able to do that for you.
Yeah, I've seen a couple places, not many, who've rolled in athletic communications with this general marketing and communications arm of the university. And that could be a positive, but also you lose some of the sense of the context of athletics. Katie, have you seen anybody doing that in your pass crossing with anybody?
Not really. Unfortunately, I'd echo Steve. I think the schools with two full-time people are pretty lucky. And even I've seen some awesome student workers through the years that are junior seniors, have gone to the CSC immersion program. But the problem is you see that content drop off when they graduate. And I think that can be disappointing sometimes for the players, the fans, the parents, the coaches, because all of a sudden they were here and you have these awesome people that are going on to be content creators at D1 programs. And that's a very specific, job that a lot of these big time D1 programs have. Like Clemson football has their own person to do all of their media, all of their Twitter. And then they probably have another 10 to 12 people on staff that are just doing content for Clemson football, not even Clemson athletics. So
That's
when
right.
you look at that, it's crazy to think about what our folks are able to output with such less staff, such less time, so many more responsibilities. And some of the output on a like comparative to comparative one-on-one are pretty close. I think it's just the consistency
Yeah.
and the amount that they're able to do it. So I think we need more people in the full-time roles. And
Yeah.
Steve said, a lot of the basic stuff is still so important, but can fall by the wayside. People don't even really write stories anymore. It's a lot of bullets. It's how it happened is like a new big thing. And you just have a few quick bullet fragmented sentences. The stories are gone. And that's a shame because I really think there's a space for both. We just need the support and investment to be able to do it.
Steve, let me follow up with you on one thing. You put together a newsletter 5 days a week. How do you get your information?
I scour the internet, looking for whether it's the idea behind the playbook started when I was still working with the Centennial Conference. It was a way that I put together information that I wanted to make sure our athletic directors and presidents wouldn't see ordinarily. And this is a way to keep them updated on what was happening. And just put it in one easy to read place where they could sweep in, read it, feel like they were ready for the day. So it would be the NCAA news. It would be stories that are still feature stories that are written by local newspapers. We still see a lot of papers, whether it's in Ohio or Illinois in particular, Wisconsin, they're still focusing on some of the smaller institutions there. And then is kind of jump around and hope that schools provide some type of interesting feature stories as well. But it's becoming more and more difficult to find that kind of content at an institutional site for the very reasons that Katie mentioned.
Exactly. Something's got to give in this scenario. And like so many things, it's all about snackable contents, consumable in short bites versus long stories that might preview a game.
Most people right now, the written word is going by the wayside, and the visual is becoming the primary, I think, in these days. So it's an interesting shift in where we were and where we're going.
Yeah. So Ryan, you're in the trenches every day talking to people who have done this, but also you're doing it yourself. What kind of advice would you have for college presidents about recognizing the transition in the skill sets and the output in this day and age?
I mean, I think we're seeing, right, that I think the leadership is aware of how important athletics is to enrollment and the health of these institutions, especially at the Division III level, smaller schools going forward. And just recognizing that, like, just general goodwill and awareness goes a long way. Like, the number one feedback we get as a network that covers Division III sports from the coaches is just the fact that there's coverage, right? Division II has nothing like what our website does, to know that like they could get an interview, on a YouTube video, or that they get a mention in one of the articles that we put out, like that's big time press for them, right? And that's something they can go on the recruiting trail and say, look, our school gets coverage. You can come here and you're not anonymous. And I do think that makes a big difference, more and more to the bottom lines, right? We're seeing some of our smaller schools in Division III are 60, 70, 80% athletes, right? That are on campus, because that's a huge draw for enrollment. And, with all the pressures that are coming, finances and enrollment cliff and all the things we talk about, like that's going to be vital. And these people who are doing your sports communication may be the only avenue people have, in the wider community to what your schools are doing, like it or
And
not, right? I'm not saying that's the best thing, but
no, no.
that is the reality.
And consistent with the university's brand. And I think that's one of the things that presidents, they get, when they wake up at 3 a.m, they think to yourself, what was on that TikTok video? Did I see it? Is it consistent with what we're saying and doing? Do you have folks who talked about that with you, Ryan?
Just in terms of like how this is representing the school.
Yeah, I mean, you want to make sure it falls within the parameters of what you want your
Well,
institution to be known for.
I would say in the last 18 months, the people I talk with are much more aware of that, which I assume means that their presidents and their athletic directors are talking to them about how everything they're doing is reflecting on the school. And that's why I said is I think the awareness is there that your coach giving an interview to some random website like ours is actually a big deal, because a lot of people are going to see that, and it's going to get aggregated across Twitter or on the playbook or wherever else it is. And you better make sure those people are representing your school well.
Exactly. Katie, I'm going to take the deep, dark leap into the world of NIL and this whole idea of athletes becoming a brand, and their whole idea of, well, you can use your social media accounts to create entrepreneurship opportunities. And of course, what's happening a lot at the Division I level is there are companies that are aggregating and feeding this information to athletic departments or to individual websites where the students can pull that information, post it on their own platforms. Has there been pressure from the athletes to try to create more social content that they can then share on their platforms? Do you know?
Not yet. We haven't heard that request yet.
Okay. Do you anticipate it coming?
I don't know. It's funny. We have a conversation all the time about whether it's appropriate to utilize student athletes handles in our posts. So even if we do an athlete of the week and it's Steve Ulrich, is it creepy to look up Steve's info and then tag him in it? But then with the best of intentions, so then he can reshare it to his people, because that's a pretty cool accomplishment. So we talk about it every year, and that's not something we've done yet, but we've talked about it, and we're kind of keeping our eye out to see if other people are doing it. We don't want to be stalkers, but I also think probably half or more of our student athletes would like that and would want to share it. But I think a few would think, this is weird. I don't know. I don't like that picture of myself, so why am I being tagged in it? Kind of thing. So it's hard to toe that line and I guess decide what the best avenue is, but it's not something we've gone down yet. And I haven't noticed a lot of conferences that do that. Even our schools don't do it. I think that would be our tipping point. Like if the majority of our schools were tagging the student athletes handles directly in highlights or stories or congratulatory all conference reposts, maybe, but they're not quite there yet either.
Yeah.
We're just to step in, say it's my sense is that the schools are still wanting to keep that separation between what the students are doing on their social media and what the schools are doing. I would say even in basketball, there's still a big push from coaches to try and get everybody's, Twitter handles and Instagram as private as possible and just not have anything get out that could, obviously the coaches are worried about, distractions or anything that happens. But I don't feel like there's that integration, especially at our level where there isn't a ton of monetization that's available, right? It's not like you're keeping these players from something that they could earn money at. It's really much more just attention.
Let me build on that, Steve. I noticed in your newsletter you've got highlights of the week type of thing. Every now and then D3 also gets into ESPN Sports Center top 10. So, how do you see that being leveraged by schools?
I think when you look at everything we're doing with streaming video, I think first of all, we used to always talk to our ADs and presidents that you basically have an infomercial. If you're doing a basketball game, it's a 2-hour promotion for your school and for the conference. You're dealing with parents. It's changing channels, if you will, for a streaming broadcast. Typically, if you're watching a basketball game, you hit halftime. You're not jumping to another broadcast because you're afraid you're not going to get back to the one you wanted to watch. So you have 15 minutes where you allow the institution to provide a message or use NCAA promos or the like. So when I look at institutions, I think they want to make sure that their message is going out. And until I think it becomes more prevalent with students in terms of monetizing their name, image, and likeness, I think the institution isn't quite sure how to mesh the two.
Okay.
Do you combine with that one student who has the outlet, has the followers, has the attention, but does that bring some unwanted spotlight onto the institution? I'm not sure that D3 has figured it out yet. That said, as the three of us can all attest to, once it happens in Division 1, it's just a couple of years before it happens at Division 3.
Well,
It's
that's why I asked the
it's just a
question.
matter of time. We
Yeah.
know we all know it's coming. It's just, as Katie said, and mine as well, I just don't think it's quite there yet.
Okay. All right. So one of the questions I wanted to ask all of you is this court case that is making its way, and it could go on trial next January 2025, called House v. NCAA, which is about the broadcast NIL rights for the athletes who are participating, who are basically entertaining the audiences in the stadium, the audiences at home, and generating those millions of dollars of revenue back to the institutions. They are arguing that they deserve a piece of that pie. And yes, they make a lot of money. But could we see the same concept apply to NIL streaming that's happening at the Division 3 level? And Katie, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we had talked about it when we decided to sign the contract, and I think it continues to be at the height of conversation. When I've talked to some other peer commissioners that are going down the route of deciding if a multimedia agreement is right for them or not, pay-per-view is right for them or not, that topic continues to get brought up. I think our stance right now, Steve kind of nailed it best. We're monitoring. I'm really interested to see how that court case plays out in Division 1. Yeah. But I would anticipate that domino needing to fall before ours does. I'd also say we kind of talked about it offline before the broadcast. I think some of our thoughts have changed a lot, because when we talked about it in April, it was, okay, this is going to turn into like $10 per student athlete. If we break it all down, is this really worthwhile for them or not? And then, you start thinking about the Dartmouth case, which, while different, is still connected, and they're paralleled in the sense of, not being profitable isn't necessarily an argument anymore. So I think seeing both of those pan out will be really important for Division 3 as a whole, to see if we have to make future changes. But I think right now I'm confident in the way the money is being spent to enhance the product and their overall experience. And hopefully that is good enough. But I think we're in athletics. We're always ready to make new changes and adapt to what's coming down the pipe. And that's something we're certainly looking at and terrified of at the same time.
Right, Ryan, what are you paying attention to in this space? Do you think that there'll be more athletes in Division 3 leveraging their NIL? I think of basketball and football first, but there's others that could be creative. What are you hearing in your reporting?
I mean, obviously there's lots of student athletes with YouTube channels that are trying to get to a level that they can make some money off that, right? Like, that's happening. And I think at Division 3, it's much more likely, and I haven't really dug in as far as I'd like to in some of that. We have schools in some pretty out of the way places, something like Walla Walla, Washington, where, Whitman University is, which is a big time athletics program in a small market. Like, there's opportunities there for, not D1 money, but D1 type NIL deals because it's the only show in town, right? And I would be interested in exploring some of those places. Some of the schools that have invested a lot in athletics, Mary Hardin Baylor in Texas, certainly have the booster base and the local base to put together some of these consortiums. Obviously, like, exponentially smaller than what the D1s are doing, but like those are all things that are possible at some of our Division III schools. And so, it's going to be interesting to see whether the schools move that direction, and of course how the court cases play out, because we know Division III has a lot of different rules and regulations in place that make it more difficult for these student athletes to get extra benefits. And so, figuring out how to navigate all of this, right? Like, even if the landmark athletes find a way to negotiate, $50 a piece out of this deal, is that going to jeopardize their eligibility, right? Because Division III would have to decide whether, that's an opportunity not available to the general populace. So, is that allowed? And how does that work? Would they have to negotiate with the broadcaster itself instead of the school in order to make that work? There's a lot of these things that just will have to play out, obviously, as the court cases play out, and whatever the NCAA is going to become is ultimately the big deal for D3, because our funding comes from that Division I men's basketball tournament, right? Like, that's the whole thing. And if that goes away, Division III has to change entirely.
And that's a great point. Let me just follow up with one question on that. So let's say Mary Hardin or Whitman are doing well and local businesses want to advertise on those streaming, and maybe it's happening already. So that generates revenue to the conference or to the school. Could that then put, do you think, the athletes in a position where they can advocate for their broadcast NIL rights and get a piece of that money?
Well, I'm not sure that would be allowed under current. I mean, obviously, Katie's going to know a lot more, but that feels like D3 is very much nothing the athletes have access to could be different than what the non-athlete student has access to, right? And so that would be problematic under. You're shaking your head. Is that not true anymore?
Okay,
not anymore with the NIL language and what's in place. We used to push back on that all the time. I mean, Steve saw it firsthand, which it was it was an NESCAC student athlete with the book, right? The golfer. So he was trying to monetize something that a regular student at campus could have monetized. That's all gone by the wayside with NIL. Well, it's their direct.
I mean, that they have that opportunity, but from the school directly, right? Like, if they were asking for a piece of the money that you're getting from broadcasting, that
Correct.
may change very soon, but that wouldn't currently be allowed under
any,
right?
And it's not just Division III. That's an NCAA rule. So I think we're clouding a message by saying Division III students have different NIL opportunities than their D1 or D2 counterparts, because that's not accurate.
Right. And that's actually happening. There are some Division III basketball players who have deals with sponsors of the school to do commercials and local events. And like, that is happening. I think the broadcast part of it is probably yet to be determined, because these cases have to work their way through.
Yeah.
And if I may,
yeah.
I think the greater issue for Division III right now isn't necessarily the individual athlete coming together and asking for a piece of the pie. It's going to be all about the collective bargaining piece. When you have 300 of the 400 Division III schools who are private, I don't think the Ivy League ever expected Dartmouth to be the test case for all of this. And for example, could I see an institution, certainly in the conference that I used to work in, coming together and say, we need to collectively bargain. Our students are spending too much voluntary time in the weight room.
Yeah.
We're spending too much time on the road. We're doing this. We need to bargain. And once that happens, then what does the conference have to do? If one school has it, what do the other 9 do? Are they compelled to do something as well? Because if school A is saying, well, we want a piece of the Centennial Conference's digital network revenues, and the other 9 are like, oh, no, I don't think that's going to happen. What does that all mean? Once again, I think we're years from having that happen, but the House case will certainly trigger a lot of discussion, not only individual institutions, but certainly the Division III conference level as well.
And most of Division III, about 80% of it is private schools. And that's the issue right now with the employment case at Dartmouth. That's why the Ivy League is so vulnerable, because it would be easy to put the whole conference under that same rule. It was a little bit different in 2014 when Northwestern was suing to be able to get rights for their athletes because most of the rest of the schools at that time in the Big Ten were public. We might see a difference though with USC because they are suing for joint employer possibilities where the Pac-12 is also their employer, God rest its soul, and also the NCAA. And that could really upend the possibilities for public institutions. You all, this has been a fantastic conversation. I truly appreciate your insight, historical perspective, thoughts about the future, and even just the day-to-day managing. So thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.